At this point, I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to our amazing presenter, Alyssa.
I'm so glad you tuned into the business of being the hospitable gardener. I happen to be a huge fan of Miss Manners, Judith Martin, who does etiquette column and various books that I have enjoyed very much over time. And I kind of have adapted the idea of, what do we need to do? Sometimes we don't know how to be a good host. Our guests, whether they're human or non-human, generally we want to give them some food and we want to offer things that are going to make them feel at home. And so I put this presentation together with the idea that the butterflies, moths, and skippers that come to our yard are our guests and that we want to do the same for them. So let's get going. What's on our agenda? Today, we're going to talk about practices that welcome Lepidoptera. Lepidoptera is the term that encompasses butterflies, moths, and skippers. We are going to talk about 7 different Lepidoptera host plants, meaning plants that they can lay their eggs on and that the babies, once they hatch out, can eat. And we're going to look at 7 plants that supply nectar to Lepidoptera so that when they're adults, they can eat, because that is what Lepidoptera eat. So let's start off with the do's and don'ts to be an excellent butterfly host. Do offer a drink of water. That's probably the first thing that we do for humans is we ask them, can I get you something to drink? And we know that the butterflies would really like a butterfly puddle. Butterflies, particularly the males, need salts and minerals that they get by gathering together often on wet ground. You can create that yourself by perhaps burying a saucer that you would normally use for a plant. You can bury that in the ground and cover it with a bit of sand, soil, or water plus some water. I suggest that you put that near thirsty plants because you're going to need to be refilling that saucer pretty frequently, or you can use any other kind of liner if you want. Don't make it be deeply wet, or if it is fairly wet, put some rocks that stick up, or maybe marbles if you want something colorful, so that the butterflies have a place to actually land without getting their feet and legs deep into the water. And you can occasionally add a little bit of salt or compost or fruit that'll add some interesting nutrients that they like. Do offer a warm space, plant in the sun and out of the wind. The fact of the matter is that butterflies, like reptiles, are cold-blooded and need the sun to warm up. In the morning, they're going to be very sluggish until they've been able to get themselves warm. Their ideal body temperature is about 85 degrees. Do have something to eat whenever they arrive. If we had guests coming to our home, we would have planned some snacks or maybe a whole meal, no matter what time of year they arrived. Well, the butterflies can arrive at any point, and so they need to have something in bloom so that they can get a drink of nectar whenever they arrive during the growing season. A bloom time calendar can help you make sure that your garden has something in bloom all the time. This picture in the middle is Anna Carla, who, as an intern over at the Glen Carlin Library Garden, designed a pollinator bed. And she looked at all the plants she wanted to have in there and mapped out their bloom times to make sure that there'd be something in bloom all the time. If you don't want to do that all by yourself, you can go to the Plant Nova Natives book, which has a wonderful bloom time calendar in the back of it that shows a lot of our native plants when they bloom. Do offer food that they can see plant in mass. Here's the deal. Butterflies are actually quite nearsighted, and a single little flower isn't going to make much of an impression on them as they flutter by. They need big blocks of colors to find the flowers. So you need to have masses, often of the same flower, together to make that nice colorful impression. Good news is it also makes a nice impression on people. Butterflies tend to prefer red or purple flowers. That doesn't mean that they won't go to other ones, but given the choice, they really like red and purple. Bees prefer white, yellow, and blue. And of course, hummingbirds like red tubular flowers. Most people know that. This is a really important idea here, which is don't poison your guests. Eschew pesticides. Do not use pesticides. And there's a lot of important thinking behind this. First of all, there is no pesticide that discriminates which insects they kill. I see in popular media and posts all the time people talk about a good pesticide that somehow knows which insects are good and which ones are bad. And I actually am not enthusiastic about dividing insects into good and bad categories. I feel that if they're a native insect, they all have an important role to play in our environment. And so even if I don't like them myself and don't want them on me or feeding on me, they have a role. And so I'm reluctant to call them bad. But even at that, the pesticides don't have a brain. If they kill insects, they're going to kill all insects, adult insects. There are no pesticides that discriminate which adults they kill. Pesticides also kill life in the soil, and the soil really is the source of a healthy garden and the life in the soil. There are so many microorganisms, and they can be damaged by pesticides. A lot of people don't understand that the source of the pesticide makes no difference. It doesn't matter whether it was organic or not. In fact, pretty much all chemicals have some basis in nature. They might have gone through a few steps to get into the form of a pesticide. I've had pesticide company guy come to my door and try to talk me into letting him spray. And I said, no, I'm trying to grow these plants for wildlife. And he said, oh, good. Then you'll like our pesticide because it's made of chrysanthemums and that's not going to kill them. Well, if it kills one insect, it'll kill others, and organic doesn't mean it won't kill. Fungicides, apparently, there's some studies being done that indicate that they may be just as bad as pesticides. So the thing to do is to use non-toxic controls as a first choice. If you have a lot of aphids on a plant and you want to get rid of them, of course, you might want ladybugs who will come eat those aphids. But if you really want to deal with them yourself, use a hard spray of water and knock them off, or use your hands to squish them if that's a little gross to you. Put on some latex gloves so you don't have to touch them yourself. But that's what I mean by non-toxic controls. I also like to really encourage cultivating natural controls and changing one's standards. Nature has a way of finding a balance. This photo here in the upper right, a lot of people who grow vegetables will recognize that this is a tomato or a tobacco hornworm. And of course, we never like to see them on our tomato plants because they munch through tomatoes in a big hurry. But this one happens to have on it the cocoons of a parasitic wasp. The mother laid her eggs on this hornworm, and the babies are eating that worm from the inside. I like to call it a dead worm crawling. If we were to have killed that hornworm, then the parasitic wasp wouldn't have had a place to lay her eggs. So we like to have that little balance. One of my fellow master gardeners years ago made what I think is a great suggestion. If you grow tomatoes a lot, you usually have a volunteer tomato come up somewhere out of place. Go ahead, let that grow and designate it as your sacrificial tomato plant. And if you find a hornworm, move it over to that sacrificial tomato plant and help keep nature in its balance. This business of changing your standards is illustrated by this photo on the upper left. Here is a plant that has some holes in it. And back before I understood what they were, I would have thought, oh, how awful, it's got holes in it. But then I came to understand that these large round holes off the edge, particularly a native plant, often it's a red bud plant, this one is not, but that those are actually circles that have been cut out by leafcutter bees. And the leafcutter mama has harvested a little round circle of plant. She uses several of those that she kind of knits together into this tiny cigar-like tube where she lays the egg of her baby and she provisions it with food. And so now when I see that plant and I know that those holes were made by a leafcutter bee, I don't think that it looks bad. I honestly now think it looks like polka dots, that this bee has decorated my plant for me, and I feel grateful. And I'm pleased that my plant is helping that bee out. So that's what I mean by change your standards. The wonderful Douglas Tallamy, an entomologist who has done so much research in this area, suggests that if you step back by 10 feet, walk back from a plant, and if you don't see the insect damage on it, then you should not consider it a problem. But I am a master gardener, and it's almost a requirement that I tell you that if you use pesticides, do follow the label instructions, use all the safety protocols that are built in, and follow the directions. This meme I stole off of Facebook, and it says if something is not eating your plants, then your garden is not part of the ecosystem. If you want a pristine garden that you'll never see any signs of any insects, well, you need to understand that it's the same thing as being inside. It's not helping any of the animals around us. Another tip is do not kill the insects, your butterflies, when they rest. Leave the leaves. For years, I never thought about what happens to butterflies over winter. I knew that they didn't spontaneously generate, but I didn't think about, well, where do they go? And the truth is that all Lepidoptera overwinter as an egg, a caterpillar, a chrysalis, or an adult, and most of them do that in the leaf litter. It is what nature provides as cover. And if we rake that away, they don't have that available. I know it's not a Lepidoptera, but I've got a little robin. This was just in April when I was out in my garden and I spotted her gathering all those pieces of dead grass out of my garden where I had not been cleaning up. And you can see she's really concerned that she needs this for her nest. And I was very happy to help her out. Again, nature provides the dead material for animals to use. And if we clean it away, they don't have those resources. Leaves provide such good mulch over the winter, and then they just break down over the warm months and they add organic material to our soil. You can rake your leaves off of lawns. It's true if you leave a lot of leaves on a lawn, it's not going to help the lawn look particularly good, but you can rake them off of your lawn and move it into a bed. And as again, Douglas Tallamy says, if your beds aren't large enough for all the leaves, maybe you need to think about expanding your beds so that the leaves fit in the beds. You can also leave the plant stems of native plants, plant stems that are the diameter of a pencil or larger, and cut it down to 12 to 18 inches of stem. And that is what a lot of nesting bees will use to lay their eggs. It's become very popular to have bee houses or bee hotels now. And the truth is, Bees don't need houses or hotels. They need what nature provides, which is the stems of native plants. And if we cut them down because of our aesthetic, that we think that those stems aren't attractive, then they won't have what nature intended them to have. Leave them up for a full year through the second winter. That tends to be when the bees use those stems. Learn to embrace the down leaves as nature's ground cover. But here's the thing, if there's an area that you really must clean up, wait until there's at least 5 consecutive nights above 50 degrees. It's not a perfect thing. It's not rake your entire yard up at that time, because there is no moment when you will not have some kind of creatures using your leaf litter. But at that point, most of the things that are trying to hatch out will have probably hatched out. And the last of our tips is, do offer Lepidoptera the healthy food that they need, which is native plants. Native plants are the basis of each local food chain. It changes from place to place. And so they are the key for maintaining maximum biodiversity. If we all plant the same imported plant that grows well, then we aren't offering the individual plants that are specifically for specialty insects that are native to our area. Native plants have co-evolved in the environment with not just the wildlife, but also the fungi and the microbes, and form mutually dependent relationships with all of nature. Fortunately, in Northern Virginia, we have a great choice of native plants. We're at the bottom of the northern range of plants, at the top of the southern range of plants. We can plant plants that are from coastal areas, from mountain areas. We have a lovely range of choices of beautiful plants. They are adapted to our local growing conditions, including the weather and water. And there's every reason to believe that as our climate changes, they'll be the most able to adapt as the climate changes. They are adapted to feed the local insects, but not be killed by them. This has happened through the centuries. It would be a very poor evolutionary strategy to feed an insect and then die as a result. Instead, there's a lot of resilience built into them. We are so fortunate here in Northern Virginia to have great information about native plants and access to native plants in Northern Virginia. We have nurseries that specialize in native plants, and we have all sorts of extra plant sales that pop up every spring and fall where we can buy the native plants. The aim that I find to be a very helpful benchmark is that you need a minimum of 70% native biomass in order to really be supporting our local wildlife. Now, you may be doing more as you go above 70%, and that's a great goal to have and that I would encourage. But at 70%, you've been able to be part of the natural ecosystem. And that still allows room for a few non-native plants that aren't invasive that you can enjoy just for beauty's sake or sentimentality. A couple of important notes about native plants, and that is to be aware of the difference between a straight species, the plant that is exactly what grows in the wild without humans tampering with it at all, as versus a cultivar. A cultivar that sometimes occurs naturally, but sometimes is designed by people to be more attractive generally to people, not to insects. So the cultivars can risk being less attractive or palatable or nutritious to insects. And the things to look out for are, first of all, double flowers or a change to the fertile areas. You can see in these two photos in the right, the pink echinacea, which is a straight species, has this wonderful fertile area here. And that includes a whole lot of nectaries in there that butterfly is going after for the nectar. But the cultivated one that has been bred to look pretty to our eye has actually created many petals that go all through that fertile area. And in fact, a butterfly that lands on that is not going to be able to penetrate through to the nectaries. So this flower, while it's based on a native plant and it's very pretty, it really isn't going to be providing any support to a local insect. The other challenge is with leaf color change. Here's a straight species of ninebark that has nice green leaves that insects will love to eat. But because people like a lot of color, hybridizers have created some hybrids that make other colors, like this kind of bronzy color or purple color. And I agree, they're very, very pretty. Unfortunately, the way that color is made is because it changes the chemistry within the leaf. And we can see an example of this in our own grocery store. We know that green leafy lettuce tastes a certain way, but often when you get a similar lettuce that is very red, it has changed the chemistry and it'll often taste more bitter. Now, we as humans have palates that can develop and we can actually like that bitter flavor, but insects don't do that. They like what they like. They're not going to develop a fancy palate in their short lives. And so they're not going to eat the other color plants. The other thing to watch out for is butterfly bush. And I know that there's probably a few people watching who are very unhappy to hear that butterfly bush, while it does attract lots of butterflies, it is invasive, meaning that it has been deemed throughout much of the East Coast as a problem. And it's not about how much it reproduces in your own yard, it's about how much the seed gets out into the wild and is able to reproduce. And it is becoming a real problem in our wild areas. And the only way to control it, I mean, we have to go and pull it out of the wild areas, but as long as people are using it in their gardens heavily, it's going to continue to be a problem. Another aspect of why it's a problem within a garden is that it produces abundant nectar, which indeed the butterflies are going to love, but it means that the butterflies may not go to the native plants that need the pollination. So those are a couple of caveats. And we are at the spot for our first questions. Do we have any?
Definitely, Alyssa. We've got a couple questions for you. The first one comes from Eve, I think from Blacksburg. And her question is, how do you give butterflies a water source without creating a mosquito heaven? Actually, I think she said haven, but I would say heaven.
That's a really good point. And it has to do with how often you change it out. Mosquitoes do need at least a couple, 3 days in order to hatch eggs. And so if you keep letting it either dry out completely before you rehydrate it or change it out, then the mosquito eggs are not going to have a chance to hatch. I will also say, while that is a tip that is in my presentation, I think that it's not the thing that is going to bring the most butterflies to your garden. I would say just, have an area that you allow to not have a lot of plants on and moisten it each time you water. And so every few days, they'll have some nice water that they can get. It'll dry out, won't be a mosquito problem, and then you moisten it again. Hopefully that answers that question.
No, that's great. I know I have drip irrigation and I've seen butterflies become attracted to when the drip irrigation is on. And then, of course, it doesn't cause any issues with mosquitoes. The other question is you talked about plant in mass. Can you give us some, how many plants is that? What size is that when we think about planting in mass?
I can't really say how many plants because it depends on the plant because different plants are different sizes, but I'd say it's 2 to 3 feet square. And of course, no plants are going to be planted in a perfect square, but that kind of mass. So there are some plants that get that big. I'd say one Baptisia all by itself is probably enough to get their attention. But if you're using smaller plants, right here we're looking at some black-eyed Susan, some phlox, you're going to want several there. You want a chunk of them together.
Thanks, appreciate that. And then one last question before we move on. Can butterflies use moving water?
I haven't researched this, but my gut feeling is probably not, because they're quite delicate. Kind of depends on how moving it is. I can imagine in a natural stream, there's some sort of eddy on the corner where it's calm, and maybe they could use that. But anything that moves very quickly, no. I do have a little fountain in my own front yard that is specific for birds, and I've never seen butterflies on that. I see butterflies in my yard all the time, but not on that. Okay, moving onward. Great host plants to consider for your garden. And I want to point out this little video. This video has a monarch butterfly, and I haven't sped this up. This is a female, and right there she's laying an egg. They float very fast through a garden, and when they stop and they put their abdomen underneath the leaf, that is when they are laying a single egg under the milkweed plant. I just thought that one's kind of interesting. And that is exactly what I mean by being a host plant, a plant that a butterfly or moth or skipper can lay its egg on. And then when the egg hatches out into a little caterpillar that can eat the plant until it has gone through all the different stages to become an adult butterfly. And so, of course, since there's relationships between the butterfly and the plant, there's a limited number of plants that host each kind of butterfly. The first one that most people know about, I have to start with the obvious one, is milkweed, the Asclepias family. And they are the host plants for the monarch butterflies and also the milkweed tussock moth, which is featured over here in the upper right hand corner. And I absolutely adore this caterpillar. I think it is the punk rocker of the caterpillar world. Look at him. He's so cool looking. There are over 100 species of milkweed in North America. We have 10 of them found in our area. The three most common in Arlington and Alexandria are common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, swamp milkweed, Asclepias incarnata, and butterfly weed, Asclepias tuberosa. Those are the three that we find most commonly in people's gardens and are pretty widely available to purchase. The common milkweed, which is a favorite of all of them probably for the monarchs, is a very aggressive spreader. It's this one that I've got over here on the right. I have a whole lot of it in my garden because I was happy to allow it to spread, because that's why I like to garden, is for the animals. But if you are somebody who is a tidy gardener, I recommend potentially putting it in a really large pot. Invest in a great big pot and plant it there, because it will try to spread and not really ever want to stop. A bit of a tip here: avoid using species that are not local to our area. There is one, Asclepias curasivica, the tropical milkweed, because of the fact that it doesn't die back very easily and because it hosts some pathogens, it can become a disease vector in our area. So we recommend that you really only go with the ones that are native to our area. If you have the Asclepias syriaca, the common milkweed, which, as I said, is a favorite to the monarchs, it's a good idea to cut it back during the growing season. And I'm sorry, the photo actually has cropped off here, but that's what I actually did with this one. It's cut right above where this is cropped. And what it did as a result was it put up 2 new shoots. So you get a thicker plant, but the real reason to do this is that the migratory monarchs that come through Northern Virginia generally don't make it here until quite late in the summer. And at that point, the leaves have become quite leathery and a little bit difficult for the babies to chew. And so if you cut your common milkweed 1, 2, 3 times maybe as it's growing, it's going to keep putting out new, more tender leaves that the babies will enjoy. Moving on, here's another great native plant that you may or may not be familiar with, pussy toes, Antonaria. It hosts the American lady butterfly. There's a couple of types that are available to us. Antonaria neglecta is a really great ground cover for the hot sun, and we don't have a lot of great native ground covers for hot sun. So the Antonaria neglecta is a good plant to have in your toolbox. The Antonaria plantaginifolia can also take some shade. They get the name because of these cute little blossoms that look a little bit like a little cat's toes. And here you can see this is the American lady butterfly laying her eggs on my Antonaria plantaginifolia. It likes moist to dry conditions. It's a real workhorse of a plant. If you don't know it, I recommend it. Third, violets. A lot of people don't like violets, even though they're very abundant here in Northern Virginia. They are native here and they are host to several different fritillary butterflies. They're very easy to grow. They can take a variety of conditions from shade to sun. They can take quite a bit of moisture and yet can take a lot of dry too. I have let mine grow in my yard, maybe a little bit too much. I'm starting to try to edit in some areas, but I reduced my lawn down to a very small pathway area. And I'm very happy to have them in that pathway. And in the early spring when they're in bloom, it's really pretty. Fourth plant to recommend is Golden Alexander Zizia aurea. This is a really pretty plant that is a member of the carrot dill family, which means that that whole family is host to black swallowtail butterflies, but this one is native to our area. It is a great plant because it is fairly evergreen. You'll have it showing up through winter. It dies back a little bit, but it's fairly evergreen. And then in the very early spring, it has these really pretty yellow flowers that you can see over here on the right. It grows 1 to 2 feet and can take sun or shade. And it's really special value to native bees who really like it early in the season, and it attracts beneficial insects that prey on other pests. Spice bush, a great shrub or tree, depending on how tall yours grows. It's kind of in that in between area. They can grow to be between 6.5 to 16 feet. It's a terrific plant that takes sun or shade. It is a host to the spicebush swallowtail butterfly, which has this totally cool caterpillar that you see in this picture on the lower right. The plant is dioecious, meaning that there's separate male and female plants, but you need one of both in order to set the drupes, or berries is what we usually refer to them as. And unfortunately, it's really hard to find them in a store pre-sexed so that you know that you're getting a male or a female. So my advice is to do one of two things. You can either plant several and just hope that you've got at least one of each so that you'll get those drupes, or you can potentially convince your neighbors to plant some also and hope that between you, you've got both sexes. I've actually done both. I have neighbors with spicebush and I have 5 spicebush, and I'm really pleased I have both males and females. Those drupes are really great. They have a high fatty lipid content, which is really important for our migrating birds who really need to build up their fat for migration. Has really pretty lacy yellow fall foliage. If you have deer issues, which so many of us in Arlington do, good news, it's deer resistant. And it is a plant that smells very nice, as the name spice bush would imply, and can be used for teas. I have actually not ever done so, but I should probably try doing that so I can report on how it tastes. Another great plant that has edible qualities is the pawpaw, Asamina triloba. Pawpaw is the native plant that has the largest fruit for us. It hosts a couple of different Lepidoptera, and it again is in that large shrub or small tree category where it grows between 10 to 40 feet high. It can take sun, it can take shade. It does like soil that's fairly moist. The fruit is a member of the custard apple family, and it's supposed to be really a favorite of lots of people. Apparently, George Washington was very fond of pawpaws, and people have many times tried to cultivate this for commercial purposes, but they've never found a good way to harvest the fruit and get it to market in good shape. So, really, if you want this rather exotic fruit, you kind of have to grow it yourself. Now, here's an important thing, and that is that while it's not dioecious like the spice bush is, it sets the fruit best if you have two different trees that can pollinate each other that are not clonally the same, that they're not the exact same genes. And in fact, these trees actually propagate themselves often by runners. And so you'll get a little cluster of them. So some people dig up those clusters and then sell the babies. So if you're buying from someone, you should ask them, are these all from the same tree, meaning they're clones? Or not. And hopefully, if they're honest, they'll tell you yes or no, they're not clones or they are clones. Or you can just make sure that you've got two different by buying from two different vendors. Last great thing about the pawpaw is that it is highly deer resistant. There's no plant that really will never be eaten by deer, but deer really don't like the smell of this plant. And our last host plant that I'm going to recommend is blueberries. And don't we all love blueberries? Yes, I really mean the kind that we buy in the grocery store. Blueberries host a couple of different Lepidoptera. Blueberries come in either high bush or low bush varieties. They are self-fertile, but again, it's a good idea to have more than one of two different kinds, two different varieties that bloom at the same time so that when the bees go from one bloom to another, they're getting some good variety in order to set that fruit. Blueberries notoriously like quite acid soil, so this is my opportunity as a master gardener, as we like to always advise, is that you should do a soil test. The Cooperative Extension here in Virginia offers soil test kits. They're very inexpensive, very easy to do, and you'll not only learn the pH of your soil, but what the nutrient content of your soil is, which can be really helpful in a whole variety of ways. So if you're going to plant blueberries, do a soil test. You might want to do a soil test anyway. Blueberries have really high wildlife value, all sorts of things like the blueberries, including people. And it's a beautiful plant. It has beautiful leaves, as you can see in this picture in the upper left, that turn red and burgundy in the autumn. So we're at another point for questions. Have any come up?
Alyssa, there's a question about where we might see some of these plants that you recommended in demonstration gardens. So maybe the Glen Carlin garden.
Oh,
Can you see any of these there?
We definitely have a number of them there. I'm sorry to report that our female spice bush just died over this last winter, and we're about to replace her. We have the male spice bush in place. We're hoping that we can find one that we know is female. We have some blueberries. We have the Antonaria, the pussy toes. We have zizia. Yes, we have most of the plants that I've been recommending at the Glen Carlin Library Garden. But I would really encourage you to look at whichever garden might be in your area. We have some beautiful gardens throughout Alexandria and Arlington. There's the Simpson Garden and the Buddy Ford Garden that are both in Alexandria. At the Fairlington Community Center, we have a wonderful small spaces garden in the back of that building, which is really great if you're a gardener in a small area. Take a look at those ideas. We also have in North Arlington the Sunny Garden and the Shady Garden that's right by the Bon Air Rose Garden, and they do some beautiful work over there. The Sunny Garden has just expanded, and I would guess that they have a number of these plants here between the two, Sunny and Shady. We also, it's not so much for the plants that I'm recommending, but I have to give a shout out to the organic vegetable garden that's at Potomac Overlook.
Thank you. I appreciate that overview of the gardens. We have another question. You mentioned trimming back milkweed. And so, how much would you recommend trimming it back? I mean, should we chop it, halfway, just take off a third? How much?
The rule of thumb is that you can cut back certainly by a third of what is there each time you do this. The end of the point in time that you should be doing this is July 4. It's just an easy date to remember. I mean, you could do it on July 5 and nothing bad would happen. It depends on how early you want to start cutting back. If you just do it once, do it end of June and cut back between a third and a half of the plant. If you go more than a half, you risk it not being able to regenerate very well. So next we're going to look at great nectar plants. And I will confess that pretty much all of the great nectar plants also do some hosting. I had to divide between the two plants, but the lines are really sometimes a little bit artificial. So here's the first great nectar plant I'm recommending, New England aster. This is a gorgeous and potentially very large purple flower that will bloom in the late summer, early fall. It is the host to a pearl crescent butterfly. Collectively, asters, not only the New England aster, but other asters, support 112 different species of Lepidoptera, which is really terrific. Asters like sun and moist soil. These particular ones can grow up to 6 feet tall. They are a plant that you can cut back if you like. As I was describing with the common milkweed, you can cut it back as it grows to keep it a little more compact and less tall. And it does give abundant late season bloom. This is one where one or two plants is enough to attract the butterflies over all by themselves. Purple coneflower. This is such a wonderful plant. It actually is technically not native in our Northern Virginia area, but it is native west of us. And it's a really great, happy plant that a lot of insects love. They do support 12 different species of Lepidoptera. They get to be 2 to 4 feet high. They prefer sun and moist soil. And those seed heads offer great winter interest and they attract goldfinches. And I have to tell you a story. I have a window where I do my hair every morning, hair and makeup, that looks out over my front yard. And I do exactly this. I leave the seed heads up through winter for the goldfinches and whatever else may need to eat them. And towards the end of winter, I was looking at them and thinking, oh, they're looking pretty sorry at this point. They look kind of beat up. And then, wouldn't you know, a goldfinch came in and landed. And it's amazing how beautiful the echinacea looked with the goldfinch on top of it. So it really is worth keeping it up just so that those goldfinches have something great to eat through winter. Gayflower or liatris, and there's actually several different species of liatris. I'm primarily talking about the liatris spicata, which is these wonderful spiky flowers here. They're kind of interesting because unlike most flowers, they actually start blooming at the top and work their way down. Other flowers that are spikes tend to start at the bottom and work their way up. You can get them in purple or white. I happen to have some of both in my front yard, and they grow to be 1 to 4 feet, kind of depends on how established they are. As they get more and more established, you get a thicker and thicker clump, but they give a great vertical interest starting right about now. Mine are just starting to bloom. So that means end of June. They like the sun and moist soil. Most plants that like the sun, you can give them some shade. What's going to happen is not that the plant is going to die, it just isn't going to be quite as abundant with its flowers. It is really inexpensive. This is a tip that I like to share. If you go to Costco in the early spring when they've got all their bags of bulbs, you can find a bag of 80 liatris tubers for less than 20 bucks. So it's a really affordable plant to put in if you put them in as a tuber. Yes, goldenrod, solidago. And solidago is a whole family. And this is, of all the perennials, the top heap of how many different pollinators it supports. And they are such a beautiful plant that we have blooming in late summer. It supports 150 species of Lepidoptera. They can grow up to 6 feet, 6.5 feet tall. Again, this is a plant, since it blooms so late in the season, you can keep cutting back in order to make it more dense and less tall. Do not confuse it with ragweed. A lot of people think this is ragweed and they think, no, I don't want to plant it. It's going to cause allergies. Ragweed is a different plant that is wind pollinated. It produces a lot of pollen that is designed to go out on the wind and be carried to other ragweed plants. Goldenrod is completely different. It is pollinated by pollinators, and so it makes pollen that stays on the plant until the pollinator comes to it. Makes this great late season show. It likes sun and moist soil, and this is one that deer don't usually damage if that's an issue for you. Joe Pye weed. This is such a pretty color. I love the Joe Pye weed, kind of dusky pink coloring. Maybe it's got a little peach to it too. It's a hard color to pin down, but it's very pretty. The Eupatorium family as a whole supports 42 species of Lepidoptera, which is quite a lot. It's a larval host to several moths. Depending on which type you get, either the Eutrochium dubium or the Eutrochium fistulosum, they grow 2 to 8 feet, depending on which kind you have. They also like sun and moist soil. We're seeing a pattern here. A lot of these plants like sun and moist soil. Indigo, wild blue indigo, yellow indigo, the baptisias are wonderful plants. They host several different plants. They can grow up to 5 feet, and they kind of look shrub-like, even though they are actually herbaceous plants that will completely die to the ground each year. Baptisias are a member of the pea family, and so baptisias fix nitrogen. I always like members of the pea family because they help self-fertilize the ground for you, which is a wonderful thing. They are of high value to native bees, but here's my tip. They have an extensive root system that makes the plant quite difficult to move, and it really does not like to be moved. This is a bear if you want to move it. So my advice is Be very careful where you choose to plant this. Don't plant it, right by some place that you're going to want to walk, and then you'll be surprised and say, oh, I planted it too close to the edge. This is one where you really want to look at the mature size of the plant and plant considering how big it's going to get and make sure that you're happy about that. And here's my last plant. I always like to have one plant in our presentation that I try to save from all the people who don't like it and point out its wonderful characteristics. And for this presentation is field thistle, Cercium dicolor. This is a native thistle plant. It hosts the painted lady butterfly, but it's a huge attractor to all sorts of pollinators, and butterflies absolutely love it. I grow this, I have this in my front yard. It's a biennial, which means that the first year it's going to be quite small. It's going to be only a few inches high with this little basal rosette is what it's called in the first year. And it just looks like this small prickly thing. In the second year, it goes crazy. It starts growing really fast and can reach easily up to 7 feet. I swear some in my yard have reached up to 8 feet in that second year. And that is going to be it for its life. It will die away after that second year, but hopefully you'll have some more that will replace it the following year. You may, if you want this to be constantly in your yard, need to plant some for 2 years running so that you have the first year and the second year with some first year starting on that second year so that you always have some reaching maturity. I hope I've said that well enough that I haven't confused you. It is important you should contrast it with the invasive bull thistle that it looks kind of similar to, but our field thistle has white undersides. If you look at the underside of the leaf, it's very distinctly a much whiter bottom side. And that's how you know that it's definitely our native field thistle. It is really tricky to transplant because it has a taproot. I have found that I can transplant those first year babies pretty well if I water them every day for a week and then, be sure to keep them quite moist until they've grown however much the taproot didn't come through with you. It's really hard to get the entire taproot, but it is a wonderful late season pollinator attractor. Now, I'm listing a dozen more additional supportive native plants, and you can see by this listing how many Lepidoptera species they support. This is from a Doug Tallamy website, and Dr. Tallamy is the entomologist who he and his grad students have done all the research to back up this information, and it is worth paying attention and planting some of these high value plants if you really want to support not only the Lepidoptera, but the birds that need to eat the caterpillars of the Lepidoptera and feed them to their young. And here's a few more helpful resources. I am super proud of the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website. You all have been there since you've signed on to this presentation. But if you haven't taken time to look at the tried and true selections, plant information sheets, do take some time there. Most of the plants that I talked about have a full page of information that you can print out and save if you want. Audubon at Home, Northern Virginia is a wonderful site that is all about creating habitat. The Mid-Atlantic Plant List for butterflies from the Xerces Society. Xerces is all about Lepidoptera, and they've got some good information. And of course, the Plant Nova Natives website. We are so fortunate to have such wonderful information from them. They have the Native Plant Guide that you can download for free. They have information on where to buy native plants, and they specifically have information on creating a butterfly garden. And that is the end of my prepared remarks. Are there any more questions?
Alyssa, there are. Thank you so much. So, the first question has to do with asters. There's an individual that said they had asters planted in their garden and they were doing well for many years, and then they just all died one year and didn't come back. In your experience, have you ever encountered this where there's been a complete elimination of the aster bed?
I have not had that problem with asters. Unfortunately, because there are a number of things that could cause this, it's best to look at the specifics. And that is exactly what the Master Gardener Help Desk is there for. So I haven't had this happen with asters. I've had this happen with other things. Sometimes there's a particular insect that just has a real upsurge one year and will create problems. My guess is that there's probably quite a bit of aster seeds that have dropped into that aster bed. And if it's not a soil problem, they may regenerate in coming years from that seed bank of dropped seeds. But again, I don't know for sure. So I think that's the best answer. I have had similar things happen with other plants. And I am somebody who always just figures, well, I'll just replant again. And I don't get discouraged unless I've planted something 2 or 3 times and find that it doesn't really work. There's so many great native plants that there's always an alternative for me.
You mentioned self seeding of asters. There's a question also about thistle and whether or not it will self seed.
It will absolutely self seed. Some people think too much. I actually had to edit down my thistles this year. When you do it in the early spring, it's not hard to do. So I want a few of my thistles popping up above my meadow area. They're very dramatic when they do this. And so I just edit out the ones that are too close to the edge where I'm going to walk. They are prickly. I'm going to warn you. You don't want to be brushing up against them. So I pull out any that are too close to the walkway or where there's too much together in an area, and I just edit it down. It didn't take me very long to do that.
So we have another question, and I'm gonna break this question apart. What the question is from somebody that has a lot of sun at their house. So if somebody has a lot of sun at their house, what might be a good suggestion for them to start understanding what plants grow really well in sun?
I would have to say almost all of the plants that I presented do quite well in the sun. I mean, some of them could take shade, but they could also take sun. The resources that I've mentioned, both the tried and true plant fact sheets and the Plant Nova natives, they say for each plant, what kind of light does it like? Most people prefer sun. In fact, I tend to hear more from people who say, oh, my entire yard is shady. I can't grow anything. And that's not true. We have lots of native plants that like the shade very much. But for sun, both the asters and the solidagos, the goldenrods, they all like the sun. And we've got all sorts of grasses that love the sun. Just almost everything I mentioned would like the sun.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's enough of an answer.
No, no, I think that's great. I also would add that there's the sunny demonstration garden, which I always refer people to because they can see what plants look like in a garden. And one of my favorite demonstration gardens, because it seems to be the most troubling aspect, is shade demonstration garden. Because people are like, what can I grow in the shade? I'm like, go to the shade demonstration garden. They have labels. You can see how it looks in the shade. And I always get really good feedback on that. To build on that question, what about if you're concerned about whether or not your soil is good for all of these plants that you recommended? How could one determine that?
Absolutely. Again, if you aren't sure, soil test. And we recommend soil tests for each different area of your garden. If you're trying to grow different things, for instance, lawn needs rather different characteristics than most perennials need. If you have a front yard and a backyard, you should do different tests for those. If you have an area where you're trying to grow vegetables versus native plants, you should do different tests. But those tests are going to tell you what fertility is in your soil very specifically, and you can start comparing to the plants. Now, here's the thing. Most of our native plants fit a certain description, which is the native stuff that we have here. Its pH range tends to be slightly acidic. Most of our native plants like slightly acidic soil. They tend to like some of the similar nutrients. But unless you do a soil test, you don't really know what's in there, and you don't know if you might need to start amending the soil. Once you do the soil test, you'll get a response back. It goes to Virginia Tech and they'll do the test and they'll tell you, based on what you're trying to grow, how you might need to amend it. They'll give you specific recommendations of what product, or not by brand name, but by type of thing, and how much needs to go in. So it's really a great thing to do.
And the final question we have is water needs of these plants. Do they need a lot of water, not enough, little water? And how do I know if I'm providing them enough water?
Again, we're fortunate that our native plants, of course, are adapted to grow with what happens in this area. On average, our general Northern Virginia area gets about an inch of water a week. If you don't get that amount of water, then the plants may need some water. The more mature and healthy a plant is, the more it can bridge through a cycle. So in my garden, I know that my very healthy, very vigorous goldenrod doesn't need to get watered if it goes for maybe even 3 weeks without any rain. But I know that if it goes for very much longer, or if it's super hot, like unfortunately we're supposed to have in this coming week, that they might need some supplemental water. So, in truth, if we got a perfect average of an inch of rain coming, we probably wouldn't have to water our gardens at all. But there are some plants that are a little more thirsty, some that are a little drier. I tend to plant the ones that take the dry soil more easily together in an area that I don't water very often. I put the ones that tend to like a little more water together in an area that's easy to reach where I can water it. So I'm hoping that that helps. This is another reason to use native plants because they are adapted to our native rainfall.
Awesome. Thanks, Alyssa. Appreciate it. That ends the questions and concludes this presentation brought to you by the Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia. I would like to thank our chat facilitator. You probably noticed the name Catherine Matthews on the chat. She was posting all sorts of links and helpful information. So if we all can give her a silent clap or maybe a little thumbs up in the chat, really appreciate all of your help, Catherine. And then also would like to thank Alyssa. Man, this was a great presentation, a well-designed, well-presented. You are a wealth of information. I imagine people can reach out to you directly, but they can also find you at the Glen Carlin Demonstration Garden or presenting at other events. So thank you, Alyssa. And hope everybody enjoyed today. And for the participants, there are these virtual classes every single Friday. And so because they're virtual, even when you're on vacation this summer, you can join from wherever you are in the world. So we look forward to seeing you next week or at a future time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Stephanie.